All right. Hello. Welcome to the Responsible Gaming Track Part 2. My name is Danielle Bragg, and I will be your host for this session. I'm a senior researcher at Microsoft Research's New England Lab, and my research there focuses on building systems that expand access to information, in particular to people with disabilities. For example, I've worked on projects to build better tools for sign language users and to improve text displays for low vision readers. And I've also used gamification as a mechanism for data collection. So I'm super excited for our lineup of talks for the next hour or so, which should give you a good picture of inclusivity in gaming, ranging from privacy and safety to accessibility and beyond. We have three amazing speakers whose experience and work I find truly inspiring. First, Remy Malan, Vice President of Trust and Safety and Chief Privacy Officer at Roblox. Next, we have Deirdre Quarnstrom, General Manager in the Xbox team here at Microsoft. And third, we have Christopher Power, Associate Professor at University of Prince Edward Island, also Vice President of the Able Gamers charity. For participants, please ask questions in the moderated Q&A as you like, and upvote questions that interest you. We will have time for Q&A at the very end of the session. So without further ado, we'll jump into our first talk by Remy Malan. Remy is the VP of Trust and Safety and Chief Privacy Officer at Roblox. Every day, more than 36 million people around the world have fun with friends as they explore millions of immersive digital experiences on Roblox. In addition to implementing best practices to ensure a civil environment for players and creators, Remy leads Roblox's teams for customer support, content, and player moderation and policy. All right, Remy, take it away.
All right, Danielle, thank you very much. Pleasure to be here, and I want to say thank you very much to the Microsoft team who've helped put this on. It's been truly terrific. The support and everything that we've had has been wonderful. And I'll jump right in, and would love to talk to you a little bit about creating a safe environment in the metaverse. So we should probably start with what is the metaverse and what do we mean when we say that at Roblox? For us, the metaverse is a way to encapsulate, create an environment which has many unique experiences where people come together to enjoy those experiences, and where content is something that the players, the users themselves can create. This encapsulates traditional things that we may know of as gaming. So on Roblox, you can find things that look like games. They've got gameplay mechanics, they have physics engines, just like you would expect in a regular game. And you, for all practical purposes, it would look like you're playing a game. There are other things, other experiences on Roblox, which may resemble something more like social media, where people are hanging out. It's not directed. There isn't really a notion of gameplay where people are directed to acquire scores or things like that, but people are just hanging out and interacting socially. There are yet other experiences where people may participate in a performance. A good example of this would be a musical event. So, for example, last year we hosted a Little Nas X concert in Roblox, where people could interact with each other with artifacts on the stage and sort of participate in the performance. So there might be events like that which sort of blend gameplay ideas with social media ideas, but create something very different. Our view is that there are a wide range of these experiences that you can have in the metaverse, and also that the content is something that the participants can help create and build themselves. This isn't this isn't the traditional publishing model where a game publisher is publishing to an audience. This is an environment where the creators and the players may be one and the same. So with that as sort of an idea, let's sort of dive into some of the topics that come up when you think about how do you create a safe and civil environment. And so the first thing to think about is, thinking of safety by design. I think this is something important, not only in traditional gameplay or games and in social media, but in the metaverse as well. Thinking about what are the interactions and how would you build safety into those interactions. I'm going to because of the amount of time we have today, I'm going to go through this at a pretty high level. I think you'll realize that a lot of the topics that I cover here, you could do a double click on them, or maybe even several double clicks into some of these areas. So I'm going to try and cover as much as I can in the time available, and then certainly be happy to answer questions at the end. So I think there's sort of, when you think about safety in the metaverse, there's sort of two big sort of groupings that you can sort of come up with. One is sort of the player-to-player interactions. How do people interact with each other? And that may take many different forms. There might be many different media channels that people use to communicate with each other. They may interact with each other via game mechanics or game mechanisms. Again, you'll see there are lots of analogies here to sort of things you might find in traditional gaming environments or in social media environments. The other aspect of this is because the metaverse is created by the players themselves and by people in the environment, that content becomes something also you have to think about from a safety perspective. So, what is the kind of content people would like to upload or contribute to the metaverse? People may also be writing code to create an experience in the environment. So with this is sort of the grouping of areas, you get into sort of, well, what could be some of the AI use cases that we would want to be able to look at or sort of think about in these environments? One of them which probably jumped to mind for some of you would be when we're thinking about chat or other communications, thinking about natural language processing or other tools that help us manage speech to text or topic analysis. I think that's sort of something that, as players interact with each other, is something you'll want to consider. The other thing, too, is sort of what is going on in the environment when people are interacting with each other. Is there some form of image or video classification that you would bring to the table? The notes and comments I put here, I think, are interesting. So one of them is that in the metaverse, because content can be created by anyone, contextual analysis becomes a really interesting topic. So when you think about, how am I going to build AI or apply machine learning in this environment, understanding the context within which content is used becomes a really important topic. Some of the other things we've done here, I actually want to give a shout out to Microsoft. We worked with them back in 2019 and last year on some tools to help with grooming in the environment. This was an Artemis project. So again, very pleased that we've been able to collaborate with Microsoft around research and understanding how to manage some of the safety characteristics in the environment. The other one is more of a production issue, which is if you think about systems like NLP, and for example, if you've looked at some of the transformer systems like BERT, one of the questions you get into, or one of the issues you get into, is how do you deploy that at scale in production? So being able to build, fast classification or fast runtime performance into your AI systems becomes really important, in addition to what you're doing in terms of training or building the classifiers in the first place. If you sort of flip down and look at user-generated content, a number of very similar things, of course, being able to look at language, being able to look more deeply into content. One thing that comes up here, which is really important and is a fairly hot topic, not so much in the technical sense, but definitely from a business and policy perspective, is IP infringement detection. Because in a metaverse, anyone can upload content and be a creator, you need to be able to manage IP infringement. In the US, typically people use safe harbor provisions and use DMCA process. So people take things down when a rights holder complains about it. And that's sort of standard procedure across any environment that you'll see today in the US where people upload content. What's changing, though, is that in Europe, with Article 17, which is an EU directive, it would give rights holders the ability to ask platforms to not allow content on once the rights holder has asked that content not be there. So it becomes more of a proactive requirement than a reactive requirement. And this actually leads into a larger topic here, which is when you think about content upload and what people might be doing with content, figuring out where in the design space you want to be around reactive, taking things down when they come to your attention, or proactive, things that you actively look at or make proactive decisions prior to them being used on the platform. So this becomes a really interesting thing, not only from the regulatory perspective, because that's busy changing, but also from a safety by design perspective. You may have different policies, or you may have different design points around different kinds of content about how proactive or how reactive you'll be around that. And then the final thing I'll mention here is just because people can create experiences that involves people writing code or doing other things like that, one of the other really interesting use cases is being able to do content analysis and IP infringement detection around things that may be code and are not sort of typically human consumable media like an image. So this is a less sort of standardized area. It's a much more abstract space in terms of the problem space, if you think about it for a moment, and it's something which we think is a really interesting place, and there's plenty of future work to be done there. Moving on, I did want to circle back to content policy, because I think this is a really interesting element to think about, and I want to tie this back to AI in a second here. So content policy in a metaverse becomes really important, because you need to decide what kind of a metaverse you want to have, and how are you going to establish policies to manage that. You know, one of the things is having general principles for your policies, not just content, of course, but general principles around policy becomes really important, because you otherwise run the risk of having a lot of enumerated rules and starting to lose the context around, well, why do these rules exist? What purpose do they serve? So being able to ground all of your policy work around general principles is really important. And that then helps you align to whatever platform values you may have, you know, around safety, civility, or other design attributes for your platform, or in our case, for our metaverse. Policies, of course, establish what's acceptable. They provide a framework that you can look at implementing in systems. This gets into the interesting questions around building AI systems that can implement policy. And then also looking at the boundaries for enforcement. This gets into the notion of content moderation, where you may need to say, okay, where do we draw the line, and what actions do we take? So looking at that from an AI perspective, you know, some of the observations I have in working on this are, you know, do your data sets align with content policy? And this is sort of related to some of the other things we've seen in AI recently, where biases in data sets can introduce, of course, biases in classifiers or biases in the runtime results. So it's really important to think about how will ultimately your data sets align with content policy. And this gets to having pretty different groups talk to each other. You know, having the data science folks be able to talk to the policy folks is something that becomes really important in this. And a typical policy person and a typical data science person may come from very different backgrounds. And so this is something to figure out how do you do that, and what makes sense in the way you're set up. Policy implementation we had sort of touched on, which is the standards, and how do we implement that in AI, and how far do we go? And this is a general class of automation question. It's not only AI and machine learning. You can apply this generally around how much automation do you bring in it, and of what kind. And then likewise with policy enforcement. Policy enforcement is really interesting, because this is where you would have real consequences to your users. So if you're saying, you know, you don't permit something and you're going to take some action against a user's account, that's a really important topic. And knowing where you stand on AI versus human moderation or enforcement, and how those two systems work together. How does AI and how do the human systems work together? You could imagine systems which are all the way fully automatic and there's no humans in the loop. You could imagine a system that is fully backstopped by humans, or something in between. I think you'll find that depending on what you're doing, the answer will probably lie somewhere along that spectrum. But I think this is an important thing to think about, which is how does AI mesh into your larger view of things like content moderation? And then finally, this is an inherently dynamic topic. Content policy typically changes over time. And that's because content policy is usually a reflection of what's going on in civil society. So a great example of this is the rise of new memes which, may use words which had no particular context in the past may now become overloaded with some particular context, and being able to track that if it's something of interest to you and is aligned with policies or not aligned with policies. This may be something that you want to track. So having a process by which you can track the evolution of things happening to civil society, how that interacts with, in our case, the metaverse or with your platform, and then how that ultimately feeds into your policy and AI initiatives becomes an interesting thing and an interesting set of groups to set up and run. And then finally, as part of this, the Microsoft team said, hey, Remy, what do you think is the biggest opportunity and the biggest challenge in what you're doing? So clearly for us, creating the metaverse is a huge opportunity. This is where users are both creators and players and create a wonderful range, a myriad range of experiences, literally millions of experiences. Being able to do that in a safe and civil way is a huge opportunity and creates this huge next generation of human experience for us. The biggest challenge which is one I've alluded to, I put it here, understanding intent and nuance. You could boil that down and say, listen, it's all about context, right? Understanding context and understanding what's happening becomes really important in getting a handle on what you're doing with your AI systems, how you direct them, and how they mesh in with the rest of your policy and other procedures around your platform. And thank you very much. And with that, I'll turn it back to Danielle.
Great, thank you, Remy. It's really interesting and timely stuff, learning more about intersection of AI and policy and content moderation is really fascinating. Thank you. All right, next up we have Deirdre Quarnstrom. Deirdre started the program at Mojang Studios to bring Minecraft to mainstream education, which now reaches millions of students and educators around the world. She currently leads the teams responsible for Minecraft education, Minecraft Hour of Code, Minecraft's China business, and the work to make Minecraft more accessible for players of all abilities. She also serves as a director on the board of Block by Block, a nonprofit partnership between Mojang and UN Habitat, and is a trustee on the board for the French American School of Puget Sound. All right, Deirdre, it's all yours.
Great, thanks so much, Danielle. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about building a better world through the power of play with Minecraft. If we rewind about 1 year ago, students in most of the world stopped going to school. According to UNESCO reports at the time, there were approximately 1.4 billion students in the world who were either completely out of school or doing some form of remote learning. Parents like me were scrambling to figure out how to do our jobs remotely and also manage childcare, schooling at home, supporting family members. It was really challenging. We're all using the word unprecedented. And here we are a year later, I think, still trying to navigate some of those challenges and learnings that we've had from the past year. This time a year ago, my team, the Minecraft education team, was looking to see if there was anything that Minecraft could do to help answer some of these really challenging questions. The work that we were doing last year and for the past year really started more than a decade ago with this small indie video game based on building and crafting and surviving the night called Minecraft. The game found its way into people's homes and hearts and has really from the earliest beginnings been about inspiring our players and our player community to build relationships and to build a better world. The theme of my talk today is Build a Better World Through the Power of Play. This is also our purpose statement for Mojang Studios, which is the game studio that makes Minecraft and where I work. It's also an idea and a concept that inspires me daily. About 7 years ago, Microsoft acquired Mojang, and I started at that time looking at how we could take some of the just early grassroots efforts that some educators started to bring Minecraft into traditional K-12 classrooms We saw the potential to build on that idea and that early work, and really introduce Minecraft as a way to inspire creativity and curiosity about learning across the K-12 curriculum and into higher ed. There are some really just amazing and inspiring uses across all subjects, everything from introducing young students on how to use technology, how to navigate a virtual three-dimensional space and build digital citizenship skills, all the way up through training AI in university research settings. I think one of the hardest questions that I get when I'm talking to people about Minecraft in my work is, so how is it actually used? I have a video that I will share, and I'm just going to look. I'm not sure. I may need to reshare to get this sound on. So I'm going to just pause this for 1 second, and then I'll reshare it so that I can have the audio for this video, because this explains it in a really nice way. All right.
We are born learners. We crave new challenges and new adventures. Our creativity is limitless. And when we learn through play, amazing, often unexpected things happen. In schools and in homes around the world, students are using Minecraft to build cities, explore coral reefs, to create with code, run science experiments, and to tell fantastic stories. Minecraft has always been about exploration and discovery, bringing together a global community of co-creators. Now, the next generation of engineers, biologists, and designers are inspiring us with their creations. Minecraft Education Edition empowers learners to solve problems they care about, to connect in new ways far beyond the classroom, and to build a better world through the power of play.
So I get kind of nostalgic when I see that video, because it shows clips from classrooms revisited and some of the amazing builds out from New Zealand and exploring the Māori culture and language in Minecraft worlds to really classrooms all around the globe. I have a couple more examples just to show exactly how Minecraft might be used. Here, some students built a virtual 3D printer in Minecraft using code, using a clone function to take and replicate the blocks that show up in that windmill on the left and recreate them on the pad that you see on the right. It's a really fun experience. It's kind of engaging just to watch it, but for someone who's a Minecraft player, they can imagine so many possibilities for something like this, including putting windmills all around or procedurally generating a building that they can then modify and use in another part of the world. So it really brings together skill building, really like introductory computer science and coding, along with that interest driven motivation that comes with playing a game that you love. This example is one of project-based learning or interdisciplinary learning, where the students are studying ancient Greece and they're studying architecture, history, art. We're also bringing computer science into this as well. And the students, there's two here working together in the video, building the columns and adding the columns in rather than building it block by block. So we're able to connect together different activities and skills, which helps reinforce that concept of coding to achieve something and solving problems by writing code rather than coding as a specific or separate subject for the purpose of learning to code. In this next example, the students were tasked with building a maze and then writing some basic AI to navigate that. They could do that either in blocks or in JavaScript or Python. And then once they create the maze, they get the immediate feedback of seeing it run in a Minecraft environment. It's one of the real benefits of using games. They have expectations of what will happen, and it kind of creates some enthusiasm for going in and debugging if things don't work out as they expected. That immediate payback or feedback on seeing it happen really helps reinforce the learning. And here there's a little celebration when the agent solves the maze. So we've taken this, the learnings that we've had about the real opportunities for inspiring creative approaches to learning. We recently released 150 hours of computer science lessons. That starts from beginner and block-based coding, like some of the examples that I showed, all the way through JavaScript and Python and getting into more advanced learning. As part of this, we've also seen the opportunity to do interdisciplinary learning, as I shared, and bring that into all subject areas, but also to bring in some important concepts like empathy, digital citizenship, and compassion. With our most recent Hour of Code lesson, the theme was a Minecraft Tale of Two Villages. And with that, we were encouraging students to think about empathy as they connected two villages that had different approaches, using code to solve problems, but also thinking about some of those broader life lessons and important subject areas. With Hour of Code, we've had over 200 million sessions. So this is something that really has been engaging both for students as well as in classrooms as often an introductory step in breaking down some of those barriers about what it means to be a developer or engineer. Going deeper into the areas of social justice and empathy has also been really important for us. In the fall, we released a world called Good Trouble, and this is based on the teachings of U.S. Congressman John Lewis, who talked about sometimes we need to get into good trouble in order to drive change in the world. In this Minecraft map, we've recreated social justice movements throughout history. We start in current day Washington, D.C. on Black Lives Matter Plaza, where we meet activists and protesters around the Black Lives Matter movement. We visit Malan in Pakistan and the movement for equitable access to education for girls. We meet Gandhi, Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King, and Rosa Parks, and other heroes of the U.S. civil rights movement, as well as Emmeline Pankhurst and the white women's suffrage movement in the UK in the late 1800s. Through these Minecraft settings, players are able to immerse themselves into the world, complete challenges. Also, there's historical context as part of the environment. We've also worked with educators, 3 Black educators from John Lewis's home district, to create a set of lessons and lesson guides for educators or families to use to go through as they're exploring the world. So it creates a really interesting opportunity both in the classroom as well as for individuals who are curious and want to explore this kind of content. This is available both in our Minecraft marketplace as a free download, so anyone could do it, as well as part of the Minecraft Education Edition. In January, we released another Minecraft map focused on sustainability. This is based on some of the key themes and science behind Microsoft's climate initiatives, and was released along with Microsoft's sustainability report. In this map, again, we take the science and we bring that to life, creating a set of challenges and tasks for players to explore in a Minecraft world. There's a sustainable forest where the construction materials for the map come from. There's a focus on energy and converting waste to energy, thinking about recycling and consumables. So it creates a setting where players are free to explore. In some cases, they may take a subject that they're learning about in school around sustainable building practices or energy conservation, and really see and have that come to life in a Minecraft world. We also have a set of lessons that accompanies the sustainability map. So in these areas, we're able to go from, focus on education and making access to technology education more interesting, more integrated, go into topics like social justice that can be difficult and can be divisive, and we're able to use these online virtual learning environments in order to connect people and go deeper into sustainability. Danielle also mentioned the Block by Block Foundation, and this is an area where we're moving from the digital world and actually bringing creations in the digital world to life in the physical world. Block by Block is a nonprofit partnership between Mojang Studios that makes Minecraft, Microsoft, and the UN Habitat Organization, part of the United Nations. This was started in about 2012. It's a 501c3, and so we raise money in order to support these projects that bring communities and people together in order to define what they want their spaces to look like. This photo is from a project that we did in Haiti several years ago, and it's representative of a typical community participation process. So you may have seen in neighborhoods where you live, a sign go up inviting community participation or input on a real estate project or on a development of some land. That's very typical in all parts of the world to invite community members in. The challenge is looking at architectural drawings or blueprints or understanding building codes. It's not something most of us spend a lot of time on. In this photo, I don't know if anyone can see any women in here. If you're looking closely, there are actually a couple of women a little bit left of the center of the photo, kind of on the edges, on the periphery, and probably they're accompanying someone else and not participating. If you look closely for any children or youth, there are also a couple of youth in the photo, but again, off to the edges and probably kind of behind someone else. Very typically, these processes are middle-aged men that are providing input. And that's just not representative of our cities and communities. So with Minecraft, we're able to bring in a much wider audience and make sure that we have men and women participating, that we have young people representing their perspective of what they'd like to see in their spaces, as well as people who are elderly, people with disabilities. So we're getting a much broader representation of what's needed in the space. The way it works is we would build a Minecraft model of the physical space, a neighborhood or a market or a community area, and then have a workshop where we invite people who live in that space and that community to come in and actually change in the Minecraft world and make the changes they would like to see. We often see people putting lighting in to make areas safer in early morning hours or evening hours, adding things like waste receptacles, fences, buildings for community activities for people to gather and be social. This is a project in Haiti, and some of the feedback was about having a covered area for when the fishermen came in with their catch to be able to clean them. So it's very practical, but it's using Minecraft as a way of creating connection and overcoming some of the barriers that may typically exist in a process like this. Here's a snapshot of some of the impact that we've had. So we've done over 75 projects in more than 30 countries around the world. The UN Habitat team has calculated that this work has benefited 1.7 million lives directly from the people who live immediately in those areas of the projects that we've committed to and built. We've raised money through the Minecraft community and partners, and that funds the initial workshops all the way through the construction of the sites. And we've done work to partner with local municipalities to make sure that there's maintenance commitments, as well as having these projects and the ideas and the process scale to other projects in the region. Most recently, we started a countrywide program in Ethiopia, taking some small projects and building some best practices there that can be used in other sites. Incredibly proud of this work, and it's amazing to see that going into a digital world and then having what they've created actually show up in their communities. For those of you who are in virtual conferences like this the past year, I thought this was a really interesting example. So if you're not directly connected to K-12 or higher ed or sort of capacity building in the global south, this is a corporate workshop that was done in Minecraft. So when the pandemic struck, they were considering canceling this workshop, but did a write-up of holding a corporate strategy and organizational development workshop inside a Minecraft world. So there's some really amazing scenarios of how people are being able to be agile and adapt and use tools and platforms like this in order to continue connecting and have new insights. At the end of 2019, the news outlet Polygon rated the 100 best games of the decade, and they selected Minecraft as the #1 game. But the part that I really connected with was this quote from the article, which is, "When our descendants look back upon us and upon our time, they will see many images of tyrants and cruelty, of waste and stupidity, but they will also see Minecraft, within which the next generation perhaps will begin to learn how to build a better world." All right, thank you. I will turn it back over to Danielle.
Great, thank you, Deirdre. I personally think using gaming for education is so compelling, and I remember playing games as a kid that were educational, though nothing as neat as what you guys have currently. And all the other use cases are amazing, civic engagement and engagement during COVID and so on. Great, thank you. All right, next up we have Christopher Power. Dr. Christopher Power is an associate professor at the University of Prince Edward Island on the east coast of Canada. He has been fortunate enough to spend over 20 years working in accessibility with people with disabilities and is the vice president of the Able Gamers charity. He is one of the inventors of the accessible player experience design patterns and has helped train hundreds of developers across the game industry in how to use this data-driven design language to make more accessible games. All right, Christopher, over to you.
Okay, thank you for having me. Can you see my slides and can you hear me okay?
Yes, I believe so.
Excellent, fantastic. Always worth having a quick check on that. So thank you for having me. Thank you for that introduction. And what I'm going to talk a little bit today is extending helping hands for accessible player experiences. Now that's a bit of a pun that you'll get toward the end of the talk, but I'll come back to it when we get there. So a very nice introduction there. I am an associate professor at the University of Prince Edward Island. I've worked for a long time in accessibility now. I think I have to update that 15 plus probably to 20 now as I'm starting to get a bit long in the tooth, as they would say. When we start looking at accessibility, I started in science education, then some stuff in e-learning, but the place I've really found my passion over the last number of years has been in gaming and making sure that players have a place to go and a place to find a game that meets their needs, but also, most importantly, allows them to have the experience that they want to have in gaming. Just to give you an idea, I'm very lucky to live on Prince Edward Island and work at this university. A lot of people don't know where it is. This is North America, to give you an idea. Out here on the East Coast are a bunch of Canadian provinces that are in an entirely different time zone than the East Coast, or the Eastern time zone. We're here on this small island here in the North Atlantic, and very luckily today we don't have a storm coming in. During the summer it looks like this, and we have the warmest beaches north of North Carolina. Right now it looks like this. I do recommend you try to come when it looks like this and not like this. I'm also very, very fortunate that I work with the Able Gamers charity. I've been working with them for 5 years. This month is my 5-year anniversary with the charity. And our mission is to create opportunities that enable play for players. And that's to combat social isolation and foster inclusive communities. And most importantly, improve the quality of life for people with disabilities. We do this through a variety of different activities. I'm currently the director of player research. We also do engineering research, community involvement, so our players find a warm and receptive community, an inclusive community. And we also do a lot of professional development with the game industry, looking at how can we provide accessible options to people. So a lot of people wonder, why do we talk about accessibility? Why do we do these sorts of things? Why do we look for options for players? And that's because right now in the US, if you consider that there's about 2/3 of the number of the population who actually play video games, when we work it out, we have about 46 million potential players with disabilities in the United States. With about 9 million people with disabilities here in Canada, that translates to about 6 million more in Canada. And of course, we could do this calculation around the world. Millions more also do not identify as having a disability and will use accessibility options on a day-to-day basis, either to tune the game to their preferences so they can have the experience that they want, or simply to change the way that they play. Millions of people with disabilities currently play video games, much like the broader population, and millions more are looking for new options to play your games, for all the game developers that I'm talking to in the audience. Now, accessibility has received a really big boost in the last 5 years. In the recent history, if you look pre sort of 2017, accessibility was really rare in games. We saw good examples, in particular of captioning, for example. We found some areas where people did pieces of work around remapping, and we saw a lot of single point ad hoc implementations, but they were not regularly present in design in the commercial game industry. We saw a big shift, and you saw in particular at GDC, for example, the big game developer conference, and at other events, a big uplift in the way that we talked about accessibility. All of a sudden, it was something that was on developers' mind. We were able to start having conversations about why exactly we should be providing accessibility options and what is the range of options that are available. We also talked a lot about how players want to experience their games and saw that for the most part, players with disabilities from our research want to have exactly the same experiences that all other players have. But there's also an exceptional experience, and that is that video games enable players with disabilities in a way that the rest of the population doesn't necessarily see until very recently. Of course, when we look at the pandemic and how people were driven home, a lot of people have found things like escapism or ways to experience fantasy, ways to experience arts and culture, ways to socialize online. And what games do when they are made accessible, they provide an enablement for players with disabilities to step into that society online and participate in all of those other experiences. And that's a distinctive thing to think about as our world starts to reopen, how players with disabilities, they have often been at home experiencing the worlds in our games that we now as a society value as an important part of our activity. And I think that has shifted a lot of our accessibility conversations as well. Of course, 2018 saw the launch of the adaptive controller as well from Xbox, a huge moment for the gaming industry to have a branded controller. We have the PlayStation accessibility features that were released that year. We then see in the next year our APX design patterns, which you'll hear a lot about today, but also the Xbox accessibility guidelines launched at that time. And we saw a major uptick in the number of options that were being applied in video games for players with disabilities to customize and tune their experiences. In 2020, we've had a remarkable year, and we saw games like Forza, we've had Marvel the Avengers, we've had The Last of Us 2, Assassin's Creed Valhalla, Watch Dogs Legion, Hyperdot, Grounded. All of these games had huge numbers of accessibility options. And indeed, at the Game Awards, we had our first Accessibility Innovation Award. So that was a very exciting moment that showed that this was an important part of design. We were lucky enough to have our players through Able Gamers participate in voting for these games. And we saw so many nice comments about how these games have uplifted players into the space. And one thing I'm particularly proud of is over the last year, we have trained 100 plus APX practitioners, developers who've signed on with us and come and done training to learn about the accessibility patterns I'm going to talk about today and start to think about where those opportunities are. And indeed, we've reached a point where advocacy really needs to shift to action. We feel that there's a lot of awareness now in the industry about accessibility, and now's the moment that we need to start moving this forward. For example, we have lots of really good understandings about how do we implement something like remapping of console controls. We have a lot of examples, a couple of which I'll talk about today, but we also have things like subtitling or captioning, where we now understand the range of features that need to be available within that to suit different players' needs. So now the onus is on developers to include those. But one of the big secrets is that as we enable more people into the space, there will be emergent problems. And I think a number of those, there are interesting innovations in AI that will allow us to solve some of those problems and not load the players up. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about where those opportunities are in the design space. And I just want to introduce you to the way that we think about our accessibility design space. So we tend to think about it in terms of these three layers. At the top here is the desired experience that our players want to have. In the end, that is what we are trying to make accessible. We want players to have those social environments. We want them to be enabled in the space. We want them to experience the art and culture that comes with gaming, as well as to be able to escape into all the fantasy worlds that we love. In order to get there, we have two other layers that we need to think about. We have access, which is about getting around the player feedback loop. So that means being able to put information into the game to take action, but also getting information out to understand what the next action is that needs to be taken. It's being able to react to how the game responds. But of course, because simply moving Lara Croft around the environment is not playing Tomb Raider, we also have a number of obstacles in games that present challenges to our players. Those obstacles are often designed for the average population, which then makes it impossible for some of our players, even when the access level is really properly configured for them. And so at this challenge level, we have a number of different types of options that players look for to tailor their experience and tune the game to be specifically for how they like to play. And I think when we look at AI and game accessibility, there's immediate opportunities in our access layer. As I mentioned, we're starting to get more mature in how we implement the access to our games. When we look at those controls and presentation layers that we have, there's immediate opportunities about how AI could uplift players to get them into a game faster. But there's long-term opportunities that exist within the challenge layer, which will be about extending helping hands to players during play, enabling them to take part in more games and more types of gameplay. And I'm going to touch on both of these. Now, for a lot of my presentation, I've talked already about the APX design patterns, and I would talk a lot more about them, but that's not what this talk is about. But to give you an overview, especially if you're a developer in the room, you've probably heard the term design pattern before. For those who are unfamiliar with it, the way to think of it is that it's a design language that people use. And each pattern has a name that can be recognized that acts as a shorthand for communicating with other developers about where problems or solutions might be in the game. When you look at each pattern, they come with a design problem, and that describes the barriers that will be encountered by players, a design solution, which is a very general description, and then the drivers, the players who are going to be impacted or helped by our problem and our solution. When we look at these design patterns, there's really good examples in industry, and we provide all of those through a website called accessible.game/APX. That website will be at the end of the presentation for you as well. These patterns provide a way for us to talk about these different layers of design, to break down that design space so that design teams are able to communicate with one another about what's included in their game and where they may want to include other things. So let's start with our access level. What are we talking about here? Well, I mentioned the player loop, and the way to think of it is that a player is taking action in the game world. So we can think of a game world as being anything from a table of cards to rolling dice to something as broad as Uncharted or Assassin's Creed Valhalla. When we start looking at this sort of loop here, we have players putting information into the game world and presentation coming out to them. And we've broken down our patterns into various collections. We have ones that work here on the input devices and ones that work on the output devices. So we can think of the XAC as being a major uplift within this pattern around flexible inputs. But the more important ones that I'm going to talk about today are the ones that allow players to customize controls and those that allow them to customize presentation. There's quite a lot of these, and I could go into a lot of detail, but instead I'm going to give you just some high-level ideas behind them. So in our control section, we have same controls but different. This is where players cannot use effectively the controls of the game and need some way to remap them. There's lots of different drivers behind this. I'll leave it to you to investigate yourself. The best profs, I've always been told, leave some to the players or to the students to go take a look. So I'll let you investigate that on your own. But when we start looking at this, there are really good examples from just this year. Assassin's Creed Valhalla provides a really lovely remapping interface that allows you to remap almost every piece of the interface that's out there. And one of my favorite parts is if you pick up a controller as opposed to a mouse or a keyboard, it will also change all of this presentation that's on the screen so that it shows you the controls on the controller as opposed to the keyboard. Within our controls, it may be that players need increased precision for either targeting or steering or for zoom and cameras. When we start looking at those, we have examples in Watchdog Legion where they use something along the lines of what might be called a fisheye lens sort of interface, where you're able to have a larger selection zone when doing your targeting. When looking at distinguish this from that, this is perhaps the most famous among developers, where we look at the ability to remap information so that it can be distinguished one from another. Most commonly, this is about color problems and people who have color blindness or color vision deficiencies who may need to recolor, or it may be about the fact that we need higher contrast. When we start looking at the way that this is implemented and the types of drivers that are behind it, we have, of course, Fortnite, which has probably the most famous of the colorblind modes, where they have an ability for players to really choose exactly the type of colors that they need in their interface. And the one that we talk about probably the most is Second Channel, because there's lots of opportunities to remap presentation from a visual modality to an auditory or haptic modality, or to go from an audio modality into a visual or haptic modality. And these are often the ways that we transform information. Probably the most famous example of this was The Last of Us 2 this year, where they came out with a huge number of audio cues that allowed low vision and blind players to play all the way through the game without any sort of sighted assistance. And this was a big leap forward for these sorts of second channel implementations. And finally, the one that's probably the most varied, and you've seen that there's sort of been an increasing variance, the way that we do these things expands, is when we start looking at how people can hide and show parts of their interface, either because they want it out of the way so that they have clarity in their interfaces, or because they want the size and layout to be changed. So for a player with physical disabilities, they might, for example, group a set of things together so they can be targeted more easily. Of course, this leads to a huge variety of ways to customize your interface. And we see examples like in the indie game Hypnospace Outlaw, where you're able to customize the layout of the various icons so that you can access them. Now, what I've just showed you in a very short period of time is a huge number of configuration options that people need to play. We have examples of players who spend up to 40 minutes going through the setup for each game to be able to play. That's a long time. The best we've come up with is another pattern around leaving it there, making sure that you save any of those settings that players put in, but that initial uplift is still the big problem. So I think there's a big opportunity right now in AI for access where we move from leave it there to put it there. Is there a way that we can leverage AI to learn the options that players prefer across their games and then automatically customize the new game, where a measure of success is that a player could step in under 5 minutes, where it used to take them 50 and play a game? This is a really powerful idea that will take into account modeling of the game, modeling of the player, modeling of the devices that they use to be able to do the type of matching that's necessary, but wholly achievable, as I understand it, in today's AI environment. That's only one issue that I'd like to address, but I need to move on to the challenge because I think this is where the really big innovations will be in the next 5 years. We have a large number of challenge patterns, and I think there's good work to be done, for example, in bypass of trying to detect when players need help to skip something, looking at ways that we can have house rules and match players to the types of things that they want or the challenge level that they need to play with others. But I'm going to touch on 2 different things. One is around players playing alongside the AI, which we call helping hands, and playing alongside others, which we simply call play alongside. When we look at helping hands, this is where players are not able, even with perfect access, not able to engage with the game without assistance from the game itself. This accounts for a huge number of assists. And when we look at, for example, Forza, they have one of the broadest range of steering controls that allow players to go right from almost no control at all, where the game does a lot of the steering control for them, to being able to have complete control as if they were driving a car. A very powerful assist interface that can be customized. When we look at The Last of Us 2, they presented a beautiful menu for breaking down the challenge of the game into different levels of difficulty for a variety of different facets, and players could tune the challenge for themselves, a different type of helping hand. When we start looking at play alongside, it's kind of the opposite of that. It's where we don't have assists, so we bring along another player to play with us. Perhaps the best example most recently is in Assassin's Creed Valhalla, where you're actually able to map controls to multiple controllers. So I can have one stick and buttons on one controller and the other stick and other buttons on the other controller, and I can play side by side with my friend. They're able to take on the parts of the game that I am not able to take on. And for our players, this is a way to distribute the tasks so that they can play games that otherwise they might not be able to. The open problem here is that players can only play certain games with assistance, but if that person is not available, what happens? They're locked out of the game that they love to play. Well, we know from the play alongside implementations like the one I just talked about that you can distribute tasks across different controllers or across different controls. So the big question I have is, how do we distribute tasks within the games, between the players, and also to a set of general AI agents? Now, there are games out there like Skylanders, for example, where they're able to custom build individual controls for players to play and put in AIs to shoot or steer. However, if we want developers to be able to do this, we need general platforms, general agents that can be plugged into a game, learn how the game is played, where those opportunities are to distribute tasks, and then pass them over. So for this, our opportunity for AI and challenge, or our challenge and challenge, if you will, would be to extend the helping hands. See, I told you there was a pun coming, and move play alongside into helping hands, where a measure of success is that a player can pick up a game and hand over a variety of different roles to a general AI. This would take us from advocacy to action and action to real innovation, where we start pushing that accessibility space forward and really uplifting players through AI into the design space of accessibility so that they can play more games and everyone can have that experience that they seek in the gaming space. Thank you very much for listening to me today. I think the biggest opportunity right now that can be taken advantage of is in our access layer of going from leave it there to putting it there, being able to highlight what players need and anticipating their needs and setting it up. The biggest challenge would be to look at those general AI agents so that we can distribute action between the player and the AI so that people can play together. My contact information is here. You can reach me at cdspower@upi.ca, at chris@ablegamers.org, or hit me up on Twitter at cdspower. If you're interested in the design patterns, accessible.games/APX will take you there. And also on the screen is the APX practitioner certification courses that we have 3 of currently open that we would love to see you at. Thank you all very much for your time.
Great, thank you, Christopher. I'm also passionate about accessibility and really appreciate all your work in expanding access and in communicating why accessibility is important, which I know is not always easy to do.
Well, thank you very much.
All right, thank you to all of our speakers again. These were really interesting talks. And next we have a bit of time for question and answering, which is fantastic. For those listening, we are still taking your questions in the chat, so feel free to add them and upvote what you want to hear everyone discuss. So let's start with one question from the audience, which is for all panelists. It can be challenging to convince teams to prioritize features for impact first. Any recommendations for developers and publishers on where and how to start giving back? And this relates to a question that I actually had myself, noting that in many situations, accessibility and inclusion and even policy rules can be afterthoughts with fixes or patches applied after the thing has already been built. How would you convince people to start thinking about these things earlier in the design process? And are there any examples of cases where people did that and developed something, for example, for people with disabilities, where that ended up being really useful in the mainstream? So anyone who wants to jump in on any part of those questions, please feel free.
This is Deirdre. I can share an example maybe to get us started, which is, it really comes down to being part of our culture and priorities as a team, to focus on inclusion generally, including accessibility features for people with disabilities, thinking about our priorities and our team values around inclusion and connection. So I think that's at the start, and it's, our team is enthusiastic about that. Everyone's still busy. There's still a lot of challenges, but we do find when we are inclusive from the beginning, we have much better product. And so, I'm sure every one of us could share examples of a feature that was identified and designed specifically for a problem or a disability or a specific scenario. And there's so many other applications for that. We, a couple of years ago, worked with some university students and an internship program, and they designed features for players on the autism spectrum in Minecraft. And some of the feedback that they got from working with families and community organizations was around some of the intensity of colors could be really overwhelming for some players. And so they implemented some sliders, and so ability to change both pitch and sound, as well as some of the visual intensity of some of the reds in Minecraft. That just creates flexibility through the settings to have a more comfortable experience for anyone. So that's an example of putting something in after in response to a specific request. We found with Minecraft Dungeons, which we just released recently, that engaging the team early on and sharing best practices in inclusive design is really valuable and brings insight early into the process. So the character selector that we have in Minecraft Dungeons is incredibly inclusive, and that kind of sets the bar and sets an example for other places in the game.
I can pick up from there, actually. I think all of those are really great points. And I think when you start looking at who you're communicating with, that's a really important part as well. I love that everything that was just talked about was a focus on the players, but often we're talking to devs, they focus on their players. And that's one of the arguments that works. You want players to have those experiences in your games. And when they hear numbers like 46 million players, they're like, oh, that's a lot of players who could come along and experience the thing that I'm creating. And that motivates people in that design space often. On the other hand, if you're talking up the chain to people who are maybe, say, holding the purse strings, you start talking about, well, those 46 million people will buy your game, and that will translate into money for your company. And a lot of times when we're talking to people at those higher levels, it's really around, well, there's a lot of money on the table here. There is $21 billion sitting on the table in dispensable income that could buy your games. Do you want a part of that? One of the things that has shifted is I think we didn't have the tools for a lot of these conversations in the game space. And that was one of the reasons we created the APX design patterns. They're meant to move much earlier in the cycle. You can use them with storyboarding. You can use them with wireframes. You don't need to write a single line of code to start thinking about these design features early on.
Yeah, and I'll pick up, I think some of the things we've seen are really valuable is helping the creators in the community understand the audiences. So one of the things we like to do is actually keep tabs on, player experiences and to share that with the creators themselves, because we ourselves, Roblox will provide the platform. The creators are the ones who are going to actually build the specific mechanics, but we want to give them the information. And we even find communities who've traditionally not been able to participate in video gaming using Roblox to build experiences that are actually more suitable for themselves. We've actually seen communities or self-organize around this. I think back to the larger topic of how do you make sure people think about this ahead of time, I think that's always an important topic. I think part of the work I do around policy is to actually help people think about policy topics ahead of time so that you're not in the position of where you're thinking about it as a bolt-on afterwards. And so I think that's a really important principle when you think about creating in the community or in these spaces.
Awesome, thank you. All right, we have another question that's directed towards Deirdre, but I think we can expand it so that it applies to everyone. So this person says, thank you for the fantastic talk. The impact of your work is mind-blowing. Are there opportunities for AI researchers to help contribute to impact with organizations like Block by Block? And I'd like to expand that to be more generally, how do you think that AI researchers can contribute in this space? What do you think are the biggest opportunities?
Yeah, I'm 100% certain that there are opportunities, and the value and the ideas are really going to come from that community. We have a program with Minecraft called Project Malmo that was launched several years ago through the Microsoft research team in Cambridge, and that provides some access specifically around AI research with Minecraft in general. And so that's a great place to connect and bring some of those innovative, creative ideas, because we really, with Minecraft, I talked about it in education is used in so many subjects. It's hard to talk to somebody and explain how it's used. And then that's just exponential when we think about, Minecraft or platforms like that in areas of being responsible for the climate, changing, how we interact with the planet, how we solve some of the challenges around access to healthcare and safe environments and clean water in the global south. So I don't have a great answer. I think Project Malmo is a great place to start. The Block by Block website, we also have a contact us section. So if there's someone who has a specific idea, we'd love to hear from you. It's blockbyblock.org. And we're always, we work through the UN Habitat Organization. We are in contact from time to time with researchers that have ideas. Our goal is always to empower the people who live in the communities to communicate what they want for their space, but there's so many opportunities for technology to improve and enhance that.
Awesome. Okay, Remy or Chris, where do you see opportunities for AI researchers to contribute?
I think one of the big spaces that needs some help is indie devs. I think big game shops have the resources to be able to do a lot of the accessibility work that we're doing sort of up front. Whereas having some general assets either at even the access level that could be purchased and used within games are very, very rare. And as we start looking at things like that leave it there to put it there movement I talked about, if we had a general asset that was used across a bunch of games, all of a sudden AI researchers could tap into that asset and maybe do some of those predictive things that we're looking for. So I think there's some opportunities there to try to help out smaller dev studios, but then it may be picked up also by larger studios as well.
Yeah, I think for me, I think there's some tremendous opportunities still, even though we've seen great progress, for example, on things like natural language processing. There's still, I think, incredible work still to be done around looking at how people interact with each other and understanding those interactions for many different reasons. I think in particular, as I had mentioned in my own talk, I think being able to figure out and establish the context of interactions is a really important area. I think there's a lot of work still to be done there, because it's not only the interactions that might be ones where people are communicating with each other, but if you look at the things like gameplay mechanics, how are people playing games, or how are people sharing experiences more generally together, and how do we establish the context of those experiences. I think this is an area where there are, I think, several untapped different areas of AI research still ahead of us, and I'm truly excited because I think we've seen tremendous progress here in the last couple of years, especially around some of the language advancements. But I'm really optimistic we're going to see a lot more, and I'm hoping all the researchers in our audience are going to feel very fired up and are going to go tackle some of these problems.
Awesome. So that leads into a related question about how people should prepare if they want a career in this space. So I'm curious what each of you would give as advice to students in high school, college, or grad school who want to have a career in gaming or AI. How should they prepare? What would make them stand out in today's environment? And is there anything in relation to policy or accessibility or inclusion that could actually make them stand out?
Yeah, I'll be glad to kick that one off. I think one is, yes, I think there are tremendous career opportunities in AI, or generally data science, machine learning, AI. There's a great collection of career opportunities there. I would say things that you need if you're going to be in that space as a technician. I think the old joke is how should you be good at AI? Be sure to make sure you do well at vector calculus, was for the typical prof joke answer, because there's actually a lot of math underneath it. But honestly, to truly stand out, I think today's AI practitioner and the practitioner of the future is going to be much more of a multidisciplinarian, because one of the challenges is it's not sufficient to understand the technology of AI. You need to understand the use of AI, and you need to be able to talk to particularly non-technical audiences, whether it's policymakers, as in the example I gave, or others who really have little to no idea what's going on with, an AI system. And I think that's truly going to be the standout person, because one of the challenges I do see is having people who are outside of the AI space actually understanding what AI is capable of, and for practitioners in AI to be able to set expectations and to work with non-technical people on solving problems using AI. I still feel that that's a place where we often struggle much more than we struggle with the can we train a model type of a problem.
And I think to bookend that, I would say that the other side is also very important. The thing that we find is lacking a lot is the ability to talk to people about what data they have and what do they want to know about it. So when we start looking at the type, we have a lot of people who say, well, I could use machine learning or deep learning to do this for players. And we kind of go, players don't need that. We need other things. Come and talk to us. And I think you find that in a lot of fields as well, not only in gaming, but you see it in agriculture here on our island, for example, farmers with hundreds of thousands of dollars of equipment in their fields with lots of data coming in, and people need to talk to them about what they want to know from that data. And I think seeing more of our technical people starting to have those skills of talking to stakeholders about what they want to know, be it in a gaming space or beyond, is something our programs need to step up and start doing.
Yeah, I'll add STEM disciplines are obviously critically important: science, technology, engineering, and math. In the area of AI in particular, also having like a much broader understanding and understanding history, being able to represent ethics and AI and think about anthropology and sort of broadly being inclusive and considering a lot of different elements that aren't directly in the sort of engineering or coding aspects of it. Beyond that, in terms of advice for students, I think there's great advice to think about what kind of problems you want to solve, and then explore who's doing that and what are they doing and what are their backgrounds, instead of that like very overwhelming question of what do you want to be when you grow up. I think if we can turn that to think more about what problems do you want to solve and what skills and capabilities and experiences do you need in order to do that, that will help guide people down a really productive path.
Awesome. Well, so related to what you just mentioned, Deirdre, I'm curious what each of you see as the biggest areas for growth in terms of boosting inclusion within gaming. Many of you touched on this in your talks, but if you could each kind of reiterate your vision, I think that would be really interesting for people to hear. Are there any largely untouched frontiers that we just haven't gotten to? Where can game developers and researchers have the biggest impact? Or what about the players themselves? Can they actually take charge?
Yeah, I think the largest community is the players and the player communities. We've seen a lot in the last year, the power of having conversations and having the courage to have conversations and approaching those with curiosity and empathy. So I think the more like we as individuals and representatives of the games industry can help model and set up conditions for honest, respectful conversations that overall raise awareness, that's where we really can empower generations to carry those messages and change practices and behaviors. So I think that's number one thing. Gaming environments are not always known for being safe spaces for respectful communication. I've seen a lot of progress, both in terms of policy, some of the practices that we've talked about, that how we can use technology to improve that, but generally just setting expectations for what is appropriate and kind and compassionate behavior in our communities is really important.
I think if I was to sort of look ahead, if we could get games to a point where the majority of the access layer is just looked after, it's just something that's standard that people put out, then we have a really interesting space to innovate in. Because we have our most recent data shows that if you don't implement those access level items, the challenge level doesn't matter, because players are never going to get to where that puzzle is that you've put that really clever way in. For the AI to help them. They've got to have that level. Once we can sort of get to that point where every game is putting in these really key access level, then we've got a really interesting space for AI to step into and to do some really interesting work around modifying and tuning those challenges for players, or even enabling people into social spaces in ways that we've not thought about before. So finding ways that we can represent how people want to play in terms of the rule systems they want to play under, and then matching them with like-minded players, be it in Minecraft or Roblox or in other places, to be able to find those players that they want to play with, I think. But until we have that base level, it's very hard for some players to step into that arena.
Yeah, and I would also second the comment about giving the community of players more power, letting them have the creative power to create spaces that they're interested in and to cater to their interests and needs. I think that's truly something really interesting when the community itself has the creative power, and you're not only relying on particular publishers or a limited number of publishers to publish content. It truly does empower groups who may previously have not been well represented in gaming to create spaces, to create experiences that represent their interests. And I think that's a really powerful idea, and I think would bode really well for the future, because by following that, we'll see gaming communities become more representative of civil society itself, and I think that would be a good thing.
Yeah, that sounds like it would be a great thing. All right, I think we have time for maybe one last question. Here's one for Chris. Do you feel like adding accessibility features to a game could be a unique selling point for games from smaller studios that otherwise would not be able to compete in the market? If Deirdre or Remy, you want to add anything onto this, feel free also.
So I would say we're definitely in that space now where accessibility options are part of the marketing campaign. It is something that will sell to those 46 million players, but also it shows an awareness of the studio being socially minded in terms of how they want to include people. We've seen a lot of studios this year have entire marketing campaigns around those options that they've put in and selling them not as this special corner case, but as these core features of the game that allow all players to tune their experiences. So I definitely think that there's a good space there, especially for smaller devs who want to call attention to themselves to show their really interesting innovation.
Awesome. Any last comments from Remy or Deirdre before we have to wrap up?
Yeah, I'll say for students out there, there's so much potential in gaming and entertainment as a way to connect people. And for the researchers, we'd love your help. Again, there's just so much potential. It truly is unlimited for entertainment, education, and really having an impact in the world.
Yep, no, and I would agree. There's a lot of work to do, and there's plenty of things for us to help make productive environments for gamers, for players themselves. So look forward to having everyone join us on the journey.
All right, amazing. Thank you all so much. So final big thank you to our three amazing speakers, Remy, Malan, Deirdre, Quarnstrom, and Christopher Power. So this session is closing up now, but next up on the schedule is the fireside chat with Peter Lee and Kareem Chowdhury, which should be really interesting at past. So I hope to see you there, and the link to that session should be available in the live chat. So thank you all so much for participating, and again, thank you to our wonderful speakers. Bye.